Hello. Today we're going to show you how to install an HB Industries trigger into your CZ BREN 2 pattern pistol or rifle. The trigger install is fairly straightforward. If you have ever removed and reinstalled a fire control group on an AR or an AK pattern rifle, a lot of this is going to look familiar to you. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing to do is make sure the weapon's clear, chamber, mag well, go ahead and cycle the bolt. It's easier, it seems like, to get the fire control group out if the hammer is back. So what we can do is go ahead and drop the hammer and reset it. Make sure you have the hammer back and remove the lower receiver. On the Bren, there's one takedown pin in the front of the lower receiver and kind of dovetails into the back. So just push the front takedown pin through and rock the lower forward and down to remove it from the upper receiver. With the lower receiver removed, go ahead and set the upper receiver to the side. And we're going to go ahead and put the lower receiver into a vise and get started on the trigger installation. With the lower receiver mounted securely in our vise, let's go ahead and get started on the trigger installation. It's fairly straightforward. Going to need a couple tools, a 3mm roll pin punch, and appropriately sized hammer. This one's a 4-ounce hammer, and a pair of tweezers. If you don't have a good pair of tweezers, maybe you should get one. They're very, very handy. Don't run to the family medicine cabinet and grab the tweezers in there. Just, I don't know, a good pair of kind of industrial tweezers is not just for this installation, but for a lot of gunsmithing activities is a good thing to have. In the absence of tweezers, you could, for this installation in particular, you could use a flat blade screwdriver or maybe a pick. There's a couple workarounds, but again, nice thing to have, and we're going to use them in this installation. So first thing to do is going to be to remove the safety selectors. To do this, we just need to remove the right side selector and push the crossbar spindle through the pack. It will be easier to see if we release the tension on the hammer. Use your hand or thumb to kind of ease the tension as you pull the trigger and let the hammer come forward so it doesn't slam into the lower receiver. Another thing to note here is that this pin and torsion spring, and there's a kind of a pawl there, it's kind of hard to see it, but there's a leg or a pawl that engages this detent, the safety selector detent, or the gear, the cam. I'm going to call it a detent, and you can kind of see the leg moving. The detent, or the cam itself, is separate from this crossbar. So when we push the spindle of the crossbar through, I'm going to use the tweezers to hold the detent or the gear in place. It's not terribly hard to replace it if you let it fall out, but again, because it's under spring tension, there's 3 or 4 components here, it doesn't need to come out, and it's easier just to keep it in place for trigger installation. So let's use our 3mm roll pin punch and our hammer to remove the roll pin from the right side safety selector. Just kind of drive it straight through. We'll try to set we'll set our components up here. Safety selector just slides on and off the crossbar or the spindle. And these are our selectors, but the factory selectors install the same way. So let's put those up there. Let's use our tweezers, and we're going to kind of hold this, again, the detent or the cam, up against the inside surface of the right side of our lower receiver. That way, when we push our spindle or crossbar through the pack, it doesn't bring this cam with it, or the detent gear with it. So push I guess I should show it here. So hold the detent, cam, or gear, and push the safety selector through the lower receiver. You might kind of have to twist and wiggle as you pull, but again, try to keep this cam up against the wall, or the detent up against the wall. The next thing to do is going to be to remove our hammer and sear pins, kind of like an AR. So hammer pin, sear or trigger pin down here. They are tied together with a wire shepherd's hook or a kind of a pin. You can kind of see it there. The important thing about this, I'll try to show it better in a second, is that the lower pin, our trigger pin here, is drilled in the center, and this wire spring or shepherd's hook goes through the center of the trigger pin. So as we're taking it apart, kind of take note or maybe just observe the orientation of that hole that's in our trigger pin with respect to this clip or shepherd's hook. So it might be easier with the hammer down. Kind of see it up on the top. It just goes around the hammer pin. So maybe rather than talk about it, we'll just show it. So we're going to use our tweezers and kind of pull just straight up and out. That is the retaining pin, and its orientation. Let's release the hammer. Its orientation here looks kind of like that. So again, the only thing to note at this point is the orientation of the hole in your trigger pin, because this shepherd's hook that I'm calling it, or it's maybe just a spring clip, is going through a hole in this pin and around a groove. This top hook clips into a groove on the hammer pin. So take note of the orientation of those as you are removing this, and save it in memory for later. Let's go ahead and remove our hammer pin. It's this right at the top pin. Go from left to right. It's going to come out the right side of the receiver. I like to kind of get started. Again, make sure the hammer's forward. It's going to be trickier when the hammer is back, the strut and the spring are compressed. So let the hammer come forward and push the hammer pin out from left to right. I like to just kind of get it started with the roll pin. It's not going to go anywhere under some spring tension there. And then grab the hammer maybe with one hand and kind of pull on your pin with the other hand. We'll set our pin to the side and kind of just pull the hammer assembly up and out. And hammer assembly is hammer, the strut, and the spring. So kind of three components, and that is their orientation if you need it for later. I'm going to set these maybe down on the table here. We'll come back to those. So what's left now is I guess what I'd call the fire control, or the sear, the disconnector, and the trigger itself. I'll show you again. So when you pull the trigger, all these components move on that lower pin. There's a trigger return spring on the bottom too. So under light spring pressure at this point, when we remove this bottom pin, I like to, same thing as the top, I kind of like to get it started and then use one hand to kind of hold all the components and then pull the pin out. So we'll go ahead and do that here. So kind of just got it started, and here you can see that hole we were talking about in the trigger pin. So kind of got started, all the springs are holding the components together. I'm going to reach out with my hand and kind of hold them and show it a little better. Kind of hold the components and rock and twist this trigger pin out. Set the pin to the side. And grab our fire control group here. So this fire control group is comprised of the trigger, or the bow sometimes it's called, the sear, the disconnector, and there's a disconnector spring in there, as well as the trigger return spring. And kind of just showing it here maybe for reference. We're going to reassemble it, of course, in a second, but kind of what it looks like as installed. So trigger return spring, trigger, or trigger bow, disconnector, and last two components are going to be the sear, and this is the disconnector spring. It obviously comes out, but don't need to remove it, so kind of we'll just leave it in the pocket for now. We are going to replace our trigger here with an HB Industries trigger. So let's kind of see what is in the bag. You guessed, it's a trigger. You were right. So a trigger, and also very important, is a dowel pin. So we're going to use this dowel pin as kind of a slave pin when we reassemble our trigger, or our fire control group here. Set it over there. So let's grab your HB Industries trigger, and you'll see some geometry differences in them aside from the face and the ribs. We have overstop, and we've reduced the take up slightly. We've also fit our triggers to the lower receiver a little tighter than the factory trigger. So if you notice slop or kind of some play in your factory trigger, we tried to kind of get rid of that and have our trigger be a more precise fit with both the fire control components and the lower receiver itself. So let's go ahead and reassemble our pack, well, our lower receiver using the HB Industries trigger. So we'll put the sear onto the trigger, and you'll kind of notice the little dog leg sits on in this pocket of the trigger. It might be somehow possible to install it backwards, but I think you'll recognize pretty quick when you go to install the components that it's not going to go together. So dog leg on the sear into the mating pocket on the trigger, and let's get our disconnector in there. Disconnector is going to kind of go between the, try to show it, in the gap next to the trigger, and of course on top of the disconnector spring. And at this point, let's grab our slave pin and try to show how that's going to help us. So we're going to take our slave pin and drop it through first the sear, then the trigger, and then kind of compress the disconnector spring a little bit and advance see if we can show it here. So by compressing the disconnector spring here a little bit, we can advance the slave pin all the way through the assembly here. So with this, you could center the slave pin, but for this next step, putting the trigger return spring back on, it's best to have the slave pin protrude only slightly from one side of the assembly. This spring is going to go in legs down, so when it's back in the upper receiver, these radiuses are going to rest against the bottom face of the lower receiver. So kind of slide our first side or first hoop of the torsion onto the cross pin there, or onto our slave pin, and push slave pin through. So we're going to duplicate that same action on the opposite side now, and kind of try to capture, I don't know if you can see that. So yeah, at this point we've got trigger return spring, that's our orientation, and what I keep calling the fire control group assembled with a slave pin, and we're going to drop this back in the lower receiver. Let's go ahead and slip it through. I'm going to try and show it up here. So again, we want, when we drop our trigger assembly into the lower receiver, we want these radiuses to contact the lower and then slip kind of forward. So try to show that in front of the trigger, like this. The next thing to do is reinstall our trigger pin. When we install the trigger pin, it's going to push the slave pin through the lower receiver and out the other side. So kind of don't know how well they'll show up on camera. There's our slave pin. Kind of see when you move the trigger assembly around, the slave pin's moving with it. So try to find a good way to show this. Slave pin is visible through the hole in the lower receiver. So let's go ahead and drop our true pin through, and we're going to come back and look at this whole position in a second on this whole position on the pin. So go ahead and drop our trigger pin through, and as we push it, we're going to try to advance. So we can show this. We're going to try and advance our trigger pin through the pack, and at the same time push our slave pin out the opposite side. And what normally happens, to me anyway, is maybe about, I don't know, 3/4 of the way through, I find it's easier to remove the slave pin completely, set it aside, and then kind of work the trigger pin all the way through. And the last step is to get through this hole. And sometimes if you look at it from this angle, it's much easier not on camera. You can kind of line up the slave pin with the hole in the lower receiver. Something that I should have done first, we're gonna kind of push this pin back through. What I forgot to mention is the hole for the retaining that shepherd's hook that we talked about earlier. In this case, it's kind of in the wrong orientation. So tweezers to the rescue. We're going to use our tweezers and just rotate the pin into approximately the orientation that we want it in, which is going to be, I would say it's at about a 45-degree angle with respect to that hole, because again, we're going to use the shepherd's hook through that pin and up against, or up around the groove in the hammer pin. So when we think we got that hole in generally the right location, just go ahead and advance the pin back into the pack. And you can cycle the trigger, make sure nothing's binding or feeling funky at this point. We'll put the lower receiver back in the vise here. Time to reinstall our hammer. Front face of the hammer goes, of course, opposite the strut. We're going to drop the back leg of our strut into the mating. There's a hole, or I guess a mating pocket, in the kind of selector area. This is the cross pin that holds the spring for the selector detent. And to get our hammer pin again, we're going to go from right to left through the hammer. Oopsie. Here we go. Kind of push it into place and bring our shepherd's hook into the lower receiver. Kind of try to thread it through that bottom hole while getting the top of the hook around the hammer pin. Kind of what it should look like when it's installed again. Safety selectors from left to right. Go ahead and just push it through. Reinstall our roll pin. And at this point we can kind of check function, so check safe and fire. Put the hammer in. You can check reset, so I'll show it up here. So for reset, pull trigger, set hammer, and then slowly let off trigger, and hammer resets to this ear. Again, check that safeties are operating, and they are. Can't pull the trigger with the safety on, the safety off. Fires. And let's go ahead and reinstall our lower receiver into the upper receiver, and we'll be done. Go ahead and set the hammer back onto the sear. We'll place it in the safe position, and let's reinstall our lower receiver into the upper. Grab the dovetail, install a takedown pin, verify again the weapon's clear. Go ahead and put it in safe and check fire. Check reset, check fire, and you've got a successful BREN trigger installation. Thank you very much for watching, and don't ever hesitate to reach out to us, email, phone call, social media on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, if you ever have any questions or there's anything that we can do to help. Thanks for watching.